Now it is my great honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mashinka Firunts Hakopian. A native of Yerevan, Dr. Mashinka Firunts Hakopian is a Glendale-based writer, artist, and researcher. She is an associate professor in technology and social justice at Art Center College of Design. Her work is concentrated in media studies, feminist and queer studies, visual culture, contemporary art, and SWANA, Southwest Asia and North Africa diaspora studies. Her research attends to cultural practices that intervene in existing socio-technical systems to produce alternative imaginaries of the future. In 2021, she was a visiting Mellon professor in the practice at Occidental College, where she co-curated the exhibition Encoding Futures, Critical Imaginaries of AI with Melia Yesayan at Oxy Arts. Prior to this, she held a 2-year teaching appointment in UCLA's Department of English. Her individual and collaborative work has received coverage in Art in America, Hypoallergic, Alsparez, the Los Angeles Times, Hollywood Reporter, and Armenian Public Radio. She was recently a guest, along with Mariah Carey, on Duchess Meghan Markle's Archetypes podcast. Professor Hakopian's book, Algorithmic Bias Training, or Lectures for Intelligent Machines, is forthcoming from X Artist Books. Please help me welcome the amazing Dr. Mashinka Firunts Hakopian.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that amazing introduction. And Lernik, thank you for that incredible presentation. It's an honor to be here with all of you today and to be speaking on such a distinguished panel. A quick note for the AV team, I will have a lot of slides, so if it would be possible to keep the slides up rather than my face, which is somewhat less important, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So, as Simon mentioned, my background is in art history and media studies. And I focus specifically on cultural heritage in the SWANA context. That focus may seem incongruous to us right now as we're watching events unfold in Armenia, as analysts are anticipating impending large-scale, long-term military aggression in the region. It's precisely those circumstances that necessitate that we turn our attention to these topics right now. And we have a very long history of attending to cultural preservation in moments of acute crisis. So that history, our present and possible futures, is something that I'll be discussing in the talk today. And I'll be focusing on 3 sort of additions to what we've already heard. 1, the concept of Armenian indigeneity and indigenous cultural artifacts. 2, the ways in which the cultural erasure that we're seeing happen with our monuments and artifacts is also happening in digital spaces. So it's not only material erasure, but digital erasure as well. And then finally, I'll be looking at artists' responses to all of this, specifically in the diaspora context, at artists who are trying to raise visibility and awareness of the struggle in Artsakh. So I want to begin with a very brief historical epigraph by looking at a cultural artifact that I revisited often during the events in Artsakh in 2020, the Mosho Charentir, which some of you may be familiar with, a 13th century Armenian illuminated manuscript that was recovered from a monastery in the Mush province during the genocide, and it weighs roughly twice the weight of 2 gold bars. So the 2 women who recovered it weren't able to carry it independently. It would have been impossible. They cut it in half and carried it on their backs across the province to Georgia, knowing that otherwise it would be destroyed like so many other artifacts during the Armenian genocide. So this story, I think, can be seen as somewhat perplexing in some ways. It raises the question, why would 2 refugees fleeing genocidal violence, people struggling to preserve their own lives, go to such pains to preserve a cultural artifact? And this is the statue honoring their contribution by David Yerevansi. Over the last 2 years, I've often opened talks with the historical example of the Mosho Charentir, because I believe it has crucial lessons to offer us in the present as we face the threat of renewed military violence and ethnic cleansing. Because in saving the manuscript, the women who carried it back to Eastern Armenia made a claim for the future, a claim that there would be Armenian descendants in the future to receive this cultural artifact, despite all attempts to eradicate them. and this is true of all cultural heritage, that it disrupts the ethno-territorial claims and nation-building attempts of autocratic regimes by making its own claims for the historical existence of indigenous Armenian life and culture in Artsakh and Armenia. And it's precisely because of that power that cultural artifacts hold that renders them so vulnerable to being targeted for erasure. So here I want to take a moment to clarify language and what we mean when we talk about indigenous cultural artifacts in Armenia and in the Artsakh context. Many of us here may be familiar with the term indigenous in the North American context specifically, where it refers to Native communities in the US or First Nations communities in Canada. But from a global perspective, and one that I think relates very, very closely to the Armenian context, indigenous can more broadly refer to communities that have a strong historical connection to a region and to social structures that predate settler societies, as well as to communities whose cultural and linguistic systems are deeply rooted in a connection to ancestral traditions and land. So the refrain, which most of us will be familiar with, "We are our mountains," for example, is an expression of an ancestral indigenous connection to the topographies of Artsakh and Armenia. And throughout the 2020 military offensive in Artsakh, many, like myself, described it as a struggle for indigenous self-determination. As I argued then, the 20th century history of Artsakh can be characterized as the history of Azerbaijani settler colonialism executed under the auspices of Soviet Empire. Artsakh's population was over 90% Armenian, as many of us know, when Stalin absorbed the territory and dispossessed its people of the right to self-governance. And in an express effort to, quote, dilute the Armenian majority and to dilute the concentration of Armenian communities there, a policy of Azerbaijani resettlement was pursued. So this is a very common settler colonial tactic that further gives evidence to the ways in which our history in Artsakh can be characterized as an indigenous one. So throughout the 20th century, though, the term indigenous has been absent from a lot of conversations around Armenian history and from much of Armenian political discourse. Why? The scholar Veronika Zablotsky suggests that the denial of Armenian indigenous status in West Asia actually comes from the histories of 20th century Armenian migration to the US and Europe. So Armenian refugees who were coming to the US and Europe had to align themselves with European history and identity in order to gain naturalization, in order to gain status, in order to gain property rights and the right to vote. And it was through that proximity to European history and identity that the denial of West Asian heritage took place. So given this history, it's crucial to recognize that when we're talking about Armenian cultural erasure, we're talking also about indigenous cultural erasure. And that's especially important given that Azerbaijan has weaponized the denial of Armenians' indigenous status in the region in order to justify cultural destruction. So many of the mechanisms of erasure that we heard about in the previous presentation specifically rest on the idea that Armenians are not indigenous. So, as we heard, Azerbaijan points to the widely discredited Caucasian Albanian theory, which originates from Soviet-era Azerbaijani scholars and has been dismissed by the global scholarly community, claiming that Azerbaijan is the direct descendant of a group called the Caucasian Albanians, who are claimed as the sole historical inhabitants of Artsakh. This has been a pretext for destruction of Armenian cultural heritage and removal of Armenian inscriptions from monuments in Artsakh, guided by the claim that these monuments and inscriptions are false imposters. But as scholars outside of Azerbaijan, like Igor Dorfman-Lazarev, have written, the myth about Caucasian Albania as a direct ancestor of the Turkic-speaking Azerbaijan appeared and was propelled specifically to prove that the Albanian past of Azerbaijan has no Armenian traces in it. So we need to understand this history in order to understand how to address it in the present and the conceptual framework that enables us to intervene in it. So knowing the history of cultural erasure, when the Armenians of Karvachar prepared to leave their ancestral lands in 2020, they removed bells, crosses, and khachkars from Dadivank Monastery to safeguard them. And along with key cultural artifacts, some residents of Karvachar also decided to transport the graves of their ancestors. Later, 300-year-old Armenian carpets were evacuated to Yerevan from the Shushi Carpet Museum. And Azerbaijan called this an act of, quote, theft and misappropriation by Armenians and urged UNESCO to intervene. They claimed that the carpets were looted and were, in fact, Azerbaijani artifacts. The basis for this claim was that, quote, historically, the Armenians were not engaged in carpet weaving, according to Azerbaijan, repudiating what major organizations and cultural institutions like the Smithsonian have called the age-old tradition of Armenian carpet making, which dates to the 5th century BCE. As we saw in the previous presentation, immediately after the occupation of Artsakh, concerns about the fate of its cultural monuments were confirmed by agencies like the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. On November 24th in 2020, very shortly after the occupation began, the lab verified and published visual evidence of the desecration of Armenian churches and monuments in recently occupied territories, including what we're seeing on the screen here, the toppling of a cross on an Armenian chapel in the town of Mekhakavan, the desecration of a monument in Kubatli to Armenian soldiers fallen in the First Artsakh Liberation War. And earlier this year, in a terrifying move, Azerbaijan's cultural minister, Anar Karimov, invoked the Caucasian Albanian theory to announce that a group of specialists are going to take on the task of, quote, removing the fictitious traces written by Armenians on Albanian religious temples. So essentially saying, because these are not actually Armenian inscriptions, we are now going to put together a group of so-called specialists who will find these so-called imposter monuments and remove all traces of Armenian history from them. The European Parliament responded by adopting a motion that, quote, strongly condemns Azerbaijan's continued policy of erasing and denying the Armenian cultural heritage. And something I want to bring into the conversation is that it's important to note that these acts of cultural erasure aren't just happening in physical space with physical monuments. They are also happening in digital spaces. So after the occupation, Google Arts and Culture, for example, hosted a falsified history of the region that was written by Azerbaijani state agents. This included photos of Armenian heritage sites like Gandzasar Monastery, pictured here, misidentified as Caucasian Albanian architecture. These texts and images, it's important to note, were removed very quickly after Hyperallergic published an investigation into Google's cultural erasure in digital space. Thank you, Hyperallergic, and thank you, Anahit. This is part of a much broader campaign of state-sponsored digital repression launched by Azerbaijan, which I've written about elsewhere. But I'll say briefly here that from 2018 to 2021, various reports, including those published by the Institute for the Future and major media outlets like The Guardian, outlined a sprawling digital repression campaign linked to state agents within the Republic of Azerbaijan. The Institute for the Future identified that campaign as, quote, a new form of human rights abuse. In 2020, Azerbaijan's digital campaign comprised roughly 8,000 pages on Facebook. All of these were dedicated to producing pro-governmental content and engagement, orchestrating attacks against opposition, and amplifying the algorithmic reach of disinformation. So what we see here is, on the one hand, the erasure of Armenian cultural heritage in digital space in spaces like Google Arts and Culture, and on the other hand, a sprawling digital repression campaign that erases any attempts by Armenian actors to intervene in this. So in the time that remains, I want to discuss Armenian diasporan artists' responses to the threat of cultural erasure in Artsakh, as well as in digital spaces. In my view, when we're talking about preventing cultural genocide, one of the most important contributions to that conversation has to come from artists and cultural workers themselves. So I want to begin with a project here by the LA-based She Loves Collective. When Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing and disinformation campaigns were taking place, She Loves designed a counteroffensive. They initiated an ad hoc digital campaign to label state repression and disinformation. So when one of the members of this collective would encounter a post on a social media outlet that was clearly from a disinformation actor or an Azerbaijani state agent that was mischaracterizing events in Artsakh, that was characterized by ethnic cleansing rhetoric and neo-genocidal rhetoric, they would paste this textual artwork rifle underneath it. And they did this because they saw that social media outlets like Facebook, Twitter, and so forth were making making no effort to intervene in the disinformation that Azerbaijan was involved in putting out. So they decided to intervene themselves. And they sent this to members of their community and urged them to, quote, replicate the rifle and paste it under every online aggression. The project builds on another performance that they did to raise visibility for the struggle in Artsakh that was enacted during the height of the military offensive in 2020. So uniformed in robes imprinted with rifles, the artists marched through the streets of downtown LA in an unauthorized performance that garnered publicity in LA Times, Hyperallergic, a host of media outlets, and brought, as well as television stations, and brought a great deal of visibility to what was happening. So this work was included in a digital exhibition that I co-curated in 2021 with Anahit Oshagan and Ara Oshagan through Reflect Space Gallery, which I won't talk about too much here, beyond saying that it was staged in a 360-degree virtual reconstruction of Shushi, imagining a future for Artsakh marked by return, the end of occupation, and cultural autonomy. The exhibition also included a project that I think is very important to this conversation that has done some of the most hyper-visible work for Artsakh that I have seen in public space, called the Recognize Artsakh Now campaign by Kami Abrahamian, which was a street art campaign that borrowed from a classic work by Sergei Parajanov, The Color of Pomegranates, inspired by the life of Sayat Nova. So Kami Abrahamian invited individuals to download and wheat paste this image that we just saw in public spaces to generate visibility for the campaign. And the response was overwhelming. We saw images of Recognize Artsakh Now in cities all over Europe, in cities in Lebanon, in places where it would be very unlikely to even imagine a community of allies for the Armenian cause. This really brought a tremendous amount of public attention to the cause. And in 2020, I also collaborated with Kami to install this work as an augmented reality monument here in Glendale on Artsakh Avenue, projecting a future for Artsakh and reading Artsakh Endures. So I want to end with a final image that's by the Armenian diasporan artist Ali Kat Leeds. It uses the framework of coffee ground reading, or Bajak Nael, to refuse a future marked by cultural erasure and to project a future that's instead marked by self-determination, decolonization, and justice for our communities. Bringing that future into being is the task that lies before each one of us. Thank you so much.
Speakers, please write your questions in Armenian or English, pass them around, and we'll ask them. Now is the final presentation where I'll talk about a little bit of how my research over the past 15 years perhaps applies to what's going on and how we can prevent what happened in Nakhichevan. So I'm ready to start the PowerPoint presentation, and you're not going to like the title, but this is what a dictator said just a few days ago as news spread that Ilham Aliyev is planning to resume the invasion of Armenia that he started last week. He said, "No one and nothing can stop us." And I'm going to tell you about this research and what's going on and how we can change that. Because we already see some progress with the amazing work that the ICJ team is doing, and you'll hear more about that later today. Now, last week, I thought this was going to be the breaking news of the day. Monday morning, Caucasus Heritage Watch, that amazing project at Cornell University, released images of the first major violation by Azerbaijan of the December 2021 International Court of Justice provisional decision that instructed Azerbaijan to not vandalize Armenian monuments and punish those that do. This is a satellite image of Surp Sarkis of Mokhrenes, a village in occupied Hadrut, and satellites released last week showed that it has been flattened. This did not make the news very much, except for some Twitter activity, because just hours later we found out that Azerbaijan had started an invasion of Armenia. But it's important to talk about this issue because this is as much about our past and the present as much as it is about our future. So let me tell you a little bit about more satellites. Caucasus Heritage Watch is an organization based at Cornell and Purdue that has been monitoring Armenian monuments under Azerbaijan's control. You can go to their website and see everything that they're looking at right now, and some of the destruction that has happened, including cemeteries in Sırnakh, Metztager. Of course, those happened before the ICJ destruction. That's why the Mokhrenes Church's destruction was such a big deal. Now, geospatial data or satellite imagery has been available for about 70 years to archaeologists, to anthropologists, but it's really in the last decade and a half where this was used to monitor cultural monuments. I had the honor of initiating and working on one of the very first ones with the American Association for the Advancement of Science into the destruction of Jufa. But satellite images have problems, especially if you need very recent data and there are clouds in the air and you're unable to see what is going on. So there's other ways of monitoring destruction. And what I did for the investigation in Nakhichevan, in addition to the limited satellite information that existed at the time, was eyewitness testimony, visual crowdsourcing, but also looking at state publication. We'll quickly go through them, but I also want to mention when Caucasus Heritage Watch put out their information on the Mokhrenes Church, they also released hundreds of images from Nakhichevan showing the destruction that had happened from 1997 till 2006. Now, you can do some of this investigation on your own. If you go to Google Pro Earth, you can download some imagery, like Surb Asfatsatsin of Karna, a medieval Armenian cathedral, completely disappeared from the face of the earth in Nakhichevan. This one was part of an investigation for the Wall Street Journal. The images were released later by Caucasus Heritage Watch when Azerbaijan's religious leader had a mosque built in his honor on a flattened Armenian church, and this is the opening of that. Another interesting image that has not become very popular yet because it just came out last week is an Armenian cemetery in the city of Nakhichevan that Azerbaijanis have built a monument to their flag. Now, those are examples of satellites, but there's also eyewitness testimonies that we are familiar with. And one thing my co-author Sarah Pickman and I publicized for the first time in 2019 in a major investigation in Hyperallergic was that there was eyewitness testimony by the famous Azerbaijani author Akram Aylisti to the destruction when it started in 1997. There is also imagery, baseline imagery of photography done by Argam Ayvazyan, the prominent researcher through the Soviet era, and you can actually do what I call visual crowdsourcing, spend hundreds of hours online and see what the current imagery of that landscape looks like. There are other information that is available that shows the destruction that happened in Nakhichevan. It's not very direct, so you have to spend a lot of time, and I spent about 15 years until I was able to find these documents. I mean, some of them were published later than I thought, but in 2005, to the left, you have an order for the final erasure of Nakhichevan's Armenian past that basically gave an administrative deadline. It's not obvious until we read the encyclopedia report to the right. We see images of Armenian churches by Azerbaijani artists displayed in Baku in the book, even though they've all been erased. So, even the memory of that is sometimes impossible to erase. But we also see proof of the destruction coming from the Azerbaijani government. I think this is one of the highlights of the ICJ case when the ambassador famously wrote to my editor that there's no evidence that Armenians existed. My editor was very smart. She had not told him that we were publishing declassified satellite imagery before they reached out to him. So this is the results of the hyperallergic investigation, based on the information that I mentioned. But it's important to understand what happened in Nakhichevan, what the triggers were, what the reasons were. I think we all know intuitively that this destruction happened because of Armenophobia, because of the things we already heard about, the desire to deny Armenians right to history, right to existence. But there are also very specific triggers that happened. For example, it started in 1997, probably due to some political events, including leaking of news that Russia had transferred huge armaments to Armenia. This destruction was going to happen. It was in the making for decades, but sometimes they're trigger events. Same with the 2005 resumption. There's two things that happened in 2005. Azerbaijan managed to be able, to bribe foreign officials, especially UNESCO, but it was also upset that Turkey engaged in token propagandistic preservation of Akhtamar. And, they wanted to show a different way of dealing with Armenian history. We already briefly talked about the cultural erasure in Artsakh that happened prior and after the ICJ decision, and you may hear more about that later today. But the important lessons from Nakhichevan's destruction are that destruction does not happen overnight. The process started in the 1950s with the separation, in theory, of Armenians from their cultural sites. They were proclaimed non-Armenian. And then we saw the actual physical separation. For 10 years, Armenians were not allowed to visit their sacred sites in Nakhichevan. So it took a decade until they started the final destruction. Destruction happens for many reasons. I already talked about it, but with few triggers. So sometimes important international developments can play a role. Absence of Armenians, as I already mentioned, at sacred sites enables their destruction, which is why so many of us were heartbroken when the ICJ did not include a right to a pilgrimage in its provisional decision. But we, I think, have to show to them that the way the monuments are destroyed is once you separate them physically from the people who consider them sacred. The other important part of this is Aliyev's impunity. He received this impunity after Nakhichevan, which was done covertly, so not much was expected at the time. But he really learned the lesson of impunity in 2012 with Ramil Safarov's release, and he keeps getting his international license to kill Armenians renewed. And that's what we need to stop. And we have been able to do some things, and by we I mean Armenian communities, even without knowing, I don't know the ICJ team, but I know they've used my research and I use their work to give further publicity to this. And so documentation, awareness, scholarship can become basis for legal action. The most important lesson is destruction can be prevented, and that we Armenians have an agency in this process. We are not helpless. We shouldn't just wait for things to happen to cry. We need to sometimes take things in our hands. And that means leaving no stone unturned in saving Armenian monuments. So what are the enabling factors that we should try to eliminate? As I already mentioned, ending Aliyev's cycle of impunity that we'll hear more about from the ICJ case. Of course, the best place to defend our culture, our homeland, is on the battlefield. But if we're sometimes unable to do that for a variety of reasons, it doesn't mean we stop. Remote monitoring is happening not just by Caucasus Heritage Watch, but also the Yerevan-based Monument Watch, headed by Dr. Hamlet Petrosyan, a very important project. There's a project at the American University of Armenia, and there's also local monitoring given the proximity to monuments. I know Ghazan Chetsot in Shushi can be observed from nearby. We've seen some international concern that was talked about, but something important that we need to lead a conversation on as Armenians, I think, is depoliticization of sacred sites. And that's more of a long-term project, assuming we can prevent the catastrophe and the more imminent threats. But first and foremost, we need access to our sacred sites, which come in the form of pilgrimages and worship. There are examples, I know the factors and contexts are different, but there are examples of monument preservation that are enabled and empowered with Armenian access, the most prominent one being on the territory of Iran, where they have an annual July pilgrimage to this amazing Tadeivan Cathedral, which now is a UNESCO site itself, and the pilgrimage is also a UNESCO intangible heritage listing. You may say, well, that's Iran, it's not Turkey or Azerbaijan. And actually, Martiros Saryan, I think he foresaw that. 1929, by this time the image was done, Khetskong in Eastern Armenia, now we call it Western Armenia because it's in Turkey, but Khetskong, right across from the border, came under Turkish control. And he showed this image of a pilgrimage and the importance of Armenian presence and agency of our monuments. And we see what happened when that stopped. Same in Western Armenia, the few fragments that exist are typically due to tourists and pilgrims. I'm not saying take a tour to Turkey. I'm saying tell me what you're willing to do to save our history. And sometimes we have to make hard choices. And sometimes, if we are able to eliminate the segregation that's posed against us toward our monuments, even if we may go and be present at a token preservation place like Ahtamar, sometimes the locals will start spelling the name of the church correctly, like they did at this tourist stop on Island Vaughan. It's important to leave no stone unturned in this fight, because this is the alternative. This is the flattened field of the world's largest medieval Armenian cemetery, Jula, or Julfa, that I saw in 2013. It was as if nothing had remained there. And we are the ones who need to stop this. And we have to stop Aliyev. And that's why we can. Thank you. Now we'll take questions from the audience, so please bring them to me. Okay, the very interesting first question, and that is, we know what Azerbaijan is doing, but do we know what the Armenian government is doing to counter this? And perhaps I'll also ask it in Armenian for Dr. Hovanesyan. Մենք հասկանում ենք, գիտենք Ադրբեջանը ինչ անում, բայց ինչ անում այսօր Հայաստանի իշխանությունը, հայկական իշխանությունները ցեղասպանությունը, մշակութային ցեղասպանությունը կանխելու համար։ Լերնք եթե ցույց դուք սկզբում պատասխանեք, հետո։
Շնորհակալություն հարցի համար։ Եկա Հայաստանի Հանրապետության իշխանությունների անունից համապատասխան պետական լեզվոր մարմինի անունից իրավունք չունեմ ես որևէ ուրեմն հարցի պատասխանեմ, բայց այն որ աշխատանք կատարվում է դա միանշանակ է։ Իսկ կոնկրետ Արցախի իշխանությունները քայլեր են ձեռնարկում օկուպացված տարածքների հուշարձանների պաշտպանության ուղղությամբ, մասնավորապես շատ կարևոր է 2022 թվականի մայիսի 30-ին Արցախի Հանրապետության նախագահի հրամանով ստեղծվել է Արցախի Հանրապետության օկուպացված տարածքների մշակութային ժառանգության պահպանության խորհուրդ, որի 3 անդամներս այստեղ ենք, արտգործնախարար Դավիթ Բաբայան, Եղիշե Կիրակոսյան եւ ես, եւ այդ հանձնաժողովը ընդգրկում է ոչ միայն Արցախի Հանրապետության համապատասխան գերատեսչությունների եւ հայ առաքելական եկեղեցու Արցախի թեմի ներկայացուցիչներ, այլ նաեւ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության համապատասխան պետական լիազոր մարմինների ներկայացուցիչ, մասնավորապես Հայաստանի Հանրապետության Կրթության, գիտության, մշակույթի եւ սպորտի նախարարությունից, արտաքին գործերի նախարարությունից, նաեւ փորձագետներ, մասնավորապես նոր Սիմոն Մաղաքյանը նշեց Համլետ Պետրոսյանի անունը, որը նույնպես մեր համապատասխան խորհրդի անդամ է, Ռաֆիկ Հորթոշյան, որը հայկական ճարտարապետության ուսումնասիրող հիմնադրամի ուրեմն ներկայացուցիչն է, եւ առաջին հենց նիստի ժամանակ տրվել է համապատասխան հանձնարարականներ, որը արդեն կատարվում է, մասնավորապես թանգարանների պահով արդեն բոլոր ցուցանմուշների ցանկերը ճշտված են, որովհետև այն 20885 ցուցանմուշը, որը մնացել է թշնամու տիրապետության տակ, այսօր նրանց ճակատագիրը մեզ անհայտ է, որովհետև վերջին տեղեկությունները դա, որ հաղորդել են մեզ ռուս խաղապահները, դա վերաբերվում է 2020 թվականի դեկտեմբերին, եւ Ադրբեջանի մշակույթի նախարարության կողմից այդ բոլոր ցուցանմուշները դրվել են արկղների մեջ, կոնկրետ Շուշիի պարագայում եւ կանգնել են, թե որտեղ է հիմա մեզ անհայտ է։ Նաեւ ասեմ, որ բացի պետական թանգարաններից մարդկանց մասնավոր հավաքածուներ, մասնավորապես օրինակ Շուշիում ապրող 2 Արցախի հայտնի նկարիչների Սամվել Թավադյանի եւ Հովիկ Գասպարյանի մասնավոր հավաքածուներն են մնացել թշնամու տիրապետության տակ, Հադրութում Էմիլ Աբրամյանի հավաքածուն, Ադրութի շրջանի Տյակ գյուղում մնացել է Դիզակի գույներ ցուցահանդեսի ուրեմն նկարների գեղանկարների հավաքածուն, որը տարբեր նկարիչների աշխարհի մոտ 13 երկրների նկարիչների աշխատանքներ պարունակում։ Այն նույնպես ցավոք սրտի մնացել է թշնամու վերահսկողության տակ, բացառությամբ 30 նկարի, որը 2019-ին տարված էր Մոսկվա ցուցահանդեսի տեխնիկական պատճառներով ուշ են բերել եւ գոնե այդ 30 նկարը փրկվել է։ Մի խոսքով աշխատանքները կատարվում են այդ ուղղությամբ, մյուսը դա արդեն իսկ հուշարձանների հստակ, ասենք մենք մոտ 2000, բայց պետք է հստակություն մտցվի եւ նաեւ այդ ամենը ըստ ուրեմն ճարտարապետական, հնագիտական եւ մոնումենտալ արվեստի ճյուղերի պետք է ուրեմն վերաբաշխվի եւ համապատասխանաբար ներկայացվի։ Նաեւ զուգահեռ տարբեր աշխատանքներ է կատարվում միջազգային կազմակերպությունների հետ, որը պետք է ցավով նշենք, որ դեռ գործնական որևէ արդյունք չկա։ Մեզ այդ հարցում օգնում է Հայաստանի Հանրապետության համապատասխան գերատեսչությունները, մասնավորապես արտաքին գործերի նախարարության ՅՈՒՆԵՍԿՕ-ի բաժինը եւ Կրթության, գիտության, մշակույթի, սպորտի նախարարության համապատասխան վարչությունները։
Շնորհակալություն արձագանքի համար։ Apparently moderating and interpreting is not a task that can be done simultaneously, so I did not catch most of it because I have so many wonderful questions in front of me. But if anyone wants to summarize, Mashinka, I don't know if you took notes, if you would kindly do an English summary and then add anything from yourself.
I, Tavok Serti, will reveal that my Armenian is nowhere near good enough to offer anything like a real summary. So I'm very sorry for not being able to be of more use. Yeah.
Malcolm will get you an English translation. So many wonderful questions. A lot of the questions are similar, so I apologize if I don't read the exact question you have phrased, because a lot of them repeat each other, and there's some more questions in the back if we can get them. So there's actually a lot of questions from students, which is amazing, and the question is, what is that students or youth can do in the process, in the fight of preventing cultural erasure? And Mashinka, if you want to take it first, maybe I will join you.
What students and the youth can do? Yeah, so I've seen a lot of very heartening organizing happening amongst very young Armenian diasporans with new organizations like, for example, Yerazad Coalition, which is a grassroots, ad hoc, leftist progressive organization started by young Armenian organizers and artists who essentially launched this as a digital campaign, made the decision to find like-minded people, and what they're doing is building solidarity and coalition with other similar progressive causes, from indigenous communities in the US to Palestinian liberation organizations, and they've amassed a very, very large following and are doing a great deal to build visibility. So I think a great place to start, if you're new to organizing or haven't been involved in advocacy if this is your first sort of entry into advocacy, a great place to start is by uplifting the work that other existing organizations are doing and making that work visible to others through your social media networks and your offline networks as well.
Thank you for that, and I think also following the work that's being done by the organization that Mashinka mentioned and the organizations that I've mentioned in my presentations, and I think there's a lot of activity on some social media that can be helpful. I would certainly recommend learning as much as you can. I mean, I've heard the suggestion of maybe each Armenian school should adopt an Armenian church under Azerbaijan's occupation and make it their mission to bring awareness, and perhaps not the most famous ones like Dadivang and Zizernavang, but some others that are now under Azerbaijan's control. So there's a question to me, I'll read and I'll answer, and then there's a question in Armenian for Dr. Hovhannisyan that I'll read after that. So question is, can you please comment on attempts by the Armenian government of the past to come to an agreement with Azerbaijan regarding preservation of cultural sites? I actually don't have any information when it comes to government communication of preserving cultural sites. I know there has been discussion and dialogue among Armenia's religious leader, the Catholicos, and Azerbaijan's religious leader, Sheikh al-Islam, along with the Russian counterpart in Moscow, and there was one, I believe, in October, and that was the last time they met. I don't know if this discussion happened, but one recommendation I tried to suggest through indirect channels was perhaps seeing if there can be mutual pilgrimages to sacred sites. And I know, some folks may not like the idea of, why should we let Azerbaijanis, visit Armenia and to see their sacred sites. My question would be, do we love our heritage and culture more than, we hate the enemy? And are we willing to do everything we can to preserve what is under Azerbaijan's control? And we have so much more to lose than Azerbaijan. Frankly, they have nothing to lose. So I think, despite everything that's happened, I'm showing you a mosque's photo built on an Armenian church that I intuitively guessed, and then I asked the Caucasus Heritage Watch to run the satellites, and indeed that was the case. So this man, the religious leader in Azerbaijan, has been engaged in cultural erasure, but he's also a key figure. So it's not about always being right, it's about sometimes doing what we need to do to save our culture. So I don't know if any of this has ever been discussed. There are some people who know much more about what the Armenian government may or may not have done, but for my own research, I have not seen enough. I don't want to call out any administration, but I haven't seen any of the past or present administrators going out of their way at any time to do anything significant for their protection. Besides, obviously, trying to protect things on the battle. There is a question in Armenian, and I think this is going to be for Dr. Hovanesyan. Հայերեն հարց կա, պարոն Հովանեսյան։ Ինչպես կարելի է դադարեցնել այս մշակութային ցեղասպանությունը, երբ հայրենիքը լուրջ կործանման վտանգի եզրին է։ Արդյոք առաջին հերթին ինչն է անհրաժեշտ։ Այս ասելով չեմ եկել մշակութային արժեքները եւ փաստերը շատ կարեւոր են, բայց եթե հայրենիքը այսօր կործանման եզրին է կանգնած, ինչ ենք խոսում այս ամենի մասին։
Շնորհակալություն հարցի համար։ Ես իմ խոսքի սկզբում ասացի, որ թե Հայաստանի Հանրապետության, թե Արցախի Հանրապետության դեմ վարվում է հիբրիդային պատերազմ։ Դա ռազմական, դիվանագիտական, տնտեսական, քաղաքական եւ մշակութային։ Մշակութային պատերազմը դա պատերազմի ձևերից մեկն է։ Այո, այսօր մենք գտնվում ենք ծանր վիճակում, այսօր մեր թիվ 1 առաջնային խնդիրը դա մեր սահմանների, դա մեր անվտանգության ապահովումն է, բնականաբար առաջնահերթ խնդիրը դա է, բայց դա չի նշանակում, որ չպետք է նաև մշակութային ասպարեզում եւ մշակութային այս ցեղասպանության դեմ չպայքարենք, այսինքն դրանք որևէ մեկը մյուսին չի խանգարում։ Պետքա, եթե քո դեմ վարվում է հիբրիդային պատերազմ, դու պետքա կարողանաս նաև հիբրիդային պաշտպանություն եւ հակազդում իրականացնել։ Անվտանգությունը համապատասխան մարմինները, դիվանագիտությունը համապատասխան մարմինները, մշակույթը համապատասխան մարմինները, այսինքն այդ բազմաճյուղությունը իրենք քեզ պարտադրել են։ Դու պետք է կարողանաս հակազդել թե անվտանգության համապատասխան ուրեմն բազմապրոֆիլ այդ ճյուղերով, թե դիվանագիտությամբ, թե մշակութային ցեղասպանությանը հակազդելով։
I'll make a very brief summary in my own words of the response. The question was, why are we talking about this issue when Armenia is facing the very real possibility of a full-scale invasion every moment? And the answer was, we have to fight on all fronts, and cultural security is part of security. There's a question that I think is best for Dr. Mashinka Firunts Hakopian, and that is, I think, an important question, because we know the answer to this, but we should be able to relay this to others. in a way, that would be very appealing, and that is, why should the international community care about the destruction of Armenian heritage monuments?
That's an important question, but we could also reverse it and ask how well we have done ourselves as a community at caring about the destruction of other communities' cultural heritage. One of the most unfortunate aspects of the way that we have framed discourse to this present point is that we have focused on issues of our own through an exceptionalist lens. And we are not the only communities facing cultural erasure. We are not the only community facing large-scale military violence and settler colonialism and occupation. And I think that the greater international community will care about our situation when we do a coordinated and methodical job of building coalition across communities and building links with members of struggles beyond our own.
Thank you very much. There's so many good questions. I think some of these are for the ICJ team, so maybe they will, get a chance to answer them. There's an important one though, and that is, would enforcement mechanism exist to uphold any ICJ rulings? And then I think that's the million-dollar question, because from what I understand, there's no explicit mechanism for the provisional ruling. Of course, the ultimate enforcer is the UN Security Council, but I'll let the expert talk about that in more detail later today. There are a lot of questions, but I think I have summarized the ones that have a sort of a commonality. There is one that's asking if there is documentation of all the erasure that is happening, and as I mentioned, Caucasus Heritage Watch is running the satellites, on a very frequent basis, but satellite images can only show most of the time complete flattening, like what happened in Nakhichevan. So if there is destruction of inscriptions and other things that are not easy to observe. And also there's some ways to conceal facts from satellites, whether it's by fake scaffolding or doing some work during a very, very cloudy season. So there's no way to have documentation. So it's not the only way. And that's why I emphasize the hope that we will get some sort of a mechanism of having access to Armenian monuments, regardless of what country they're in, because that's ultimately is what's going to ensure their preservation is our presence at the monuments, ideally as under our Armenian sovereignty, but if we can, at least as worshippers and pilgrims to our sacred sites. I just got a bunch of more questions, so I apologize as I'm going through this. So I've been hosting Twitter space discussions. Those are so much easier to moderate because no one can see me on Twitter how clumsy I am, while people are speaking. It's so much easier when the questions are short. Okay, so there's a question in Armenian, հայերենով կկարդամ. Արդյոք հայկական կողմի տրամադրության տակ կան ադրբեջանական մշակութային նյութեր առաջին կամ երկրորդ Արցախյան պատերազմից հետո, որոնց հնարավոր է փոխանակել օկուպացված տարածքներում մնացած հայկական որոշ նյութերի հետ։
Շնորհակալություն հարցի համար, ասեմ, որ Արցախի հանրապետության տարածքում Ադրբեջանի մշակութային նյութեր, որպես այդպիսին, բացառությամբ Շուշիի եւ Ակնայի մոսկիթների եւ մի երկու փոքր աղոթատներ, որոնք կային Քաշաթաղի շրջանում, օրինակ Քարվաճարի շրջանում, իրանք որևէ մշակութային ժառանգություն չունեն եւ եթե վերցնում ենք 1988 թվականի դեռևս ադրբեջանական ԽՍՀ նախարարների խորհրդի որոշումը, որտեղ ադրբեջանական ԽՍՀ տարածքի հուշարձանների ցուցակն է, Քարավաճառի շրջանի հուշարձանը միայն նշված է մեր դադիվանք, ուրիշ եւ որպես աղվանական հուշարձան է ներկայացված։ Որևէ այլ այդպեսի նմուշներ համենայն դեպս ինձ հայտնի չէ, որ մնացել է մեր տարածքում մշակութային արժեք ներկայացնող եւ որպեսզի այդ ուրեմն փոխանակումը կատարվի, բայց արդյոք Ադրբեջանը դա կհամաձայնվի, դա հարց է, բայց համենայն դեպս մենք տեղեկատվություն չունենք, որ մեր տարածքում ադրբեջանական ինչ-որ արժեքավոր ցուցանմուշներ մնացած լինեն։
Պարոն փոխնախարար, եթե չեմ սխալվում, պատերազմից հետո հայտարարվեց, որ գոյություն ունեն յուղաներկներ, չէ, սովետական ադրբեջանցի նկարիչների կողմից արված։
Հա, այդպիսի իրանք ներկայացրել են ինչ-որ ուրեմն ցանկեր, բայց դրանց մի մասը ընդհանրապես գոյություն չունի։ Ինչպես հուշարձանների պարագայում, օրինակ ասենք, իրենք ներկայացրել են ցանկ, չգիտեմ, 60 մզկիթի, բայց հենց իրենց իսկ կազմած ցուցակներում այդ հուշարձանները ընդհանրապես գոյություն չունեն։ Հիմա ինչքանով ենք մենք համոզված, որ այդ նույն ձևով այդ յուղաներկերը երբևէ գոյություն են ունեցել, չգիտեմ, Շուշի կամ Ակնայի թանգարաններում։
The question in Armenian was if there are any Azerbaijani cultural properties under Artsakh sovereignty that could be used to leverage repatriation of Armenian cultural monuments that came under Azerbaijan's control. It was not specified whether we're talking about, sacred sites that could be swapped, geography allowing, or mobile cultural monuments. And so that's the discussion we had. But it turns out there is not, really anything that could be leveraged in this sense.